Thank you for joining us today as we commemorate the lives lost over the past 10 years in Syria and focus our attention on the millions that remain at risk today as the Assad regime and others continue to commit crimes against humanity with impunity. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. We ask your forgiveness if there are technical difficulties. If you require technical assistance, please use the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen at any time throughout the program to reach a member of the staff monitoring the call. We're offering simultaneous Arabic interpretation during our program today and ask that all attendees select either English or Arabic language channels using the interpretation button at the bottom center of your screen. Please note that you must select a language channel and should mute original audio if you have selected the Arabic language channel. You will also find these instructions in the chat. Unfortunately, we will only be able to respond to questions posed in English, and we will not have time for live questions and answers during the program. For Arabic language guests, the interpreter will now provide these instructions in Arabic.
قبل أن نبتدئ لدينا بعض الملاحظات التدبيرية. نعتذر إذا كان هناك صعوبات تقنية. إذا كنت بحاجة إلى مساعدة فنية فيرجى استخدام وظيفة الدردشة الموجودة في أسفل وسط شاشتك في أي وقت خلال البرنامج للحصول أو الوصول إلى أحد أعضاء فريق العمل الذين يراقبون الندوة. نحن نقدم ترجمة فورية للغة العربية خلال برنامجنا اليوم، ونطلب من الحضور اختيار إما قناة اللغة الإنجليزية أو العربية باستخدام الترجمة. هناك زر في منتصف الجزء السفلي من الشاشة. يرجى ملاحظة أنه يجب عليك تحديد قناة اللغة، يعني عربي أو إنجليزي، ويجب كتم الصوت الأصلي إذا كنت قد حددت قناة اللغة العربية. سوف تجد أيضا هذه التعليمات في الدردشة. لسوء الحظ لن نتمكن من الرد على طلبات الدردشة إلا باللغة الإنجليزية، ولن نتمكن من الرد على أسئلتكم لأنه ليس لدينا الوقت الكافي للرد على الأسئلة خلال هذا البرنامج. شكرا. والآن انتقل إلى القناة العربية. شكرا.
I remember I was sitting behind my desk. Suddenly, they raided the office, carrying rifles. They started shouting and they said, "Nobody move, stay where you are." Then we understood that they were the Air Force intelligence. I was shocked. I didn't want to believe. I didn't expect that I will be later detained and tortured and I will spend almost a year underground. Down there in that place, it's dark. If the jailer hear anything, they come down and punish us and ask for arbitrarily 5 people to go out and they start beating them. We don't know if we are going to survive or no. They could do anything to you because nobody knows that you are here. Your family, your lawyers, nobody has access to you and the government is denying you. So we decided to start documenting the phone numbers and the names in case one of this group is released, he can contact the family. We already have these shirt pieces that we could use for writing, but we needed some kind of ink. One of our group, he asked for a plastic bag and he went to the bathroom area and came back carrying the plastic bag with something red in it. He told us that he squeezed his gum and spit the blood inside this. We thought that it would fade later with time, so we mixed some rust with the blood, and that's how we got the perfect ink. We arrived to the point that we should smuggle them, but we don't know how. One of our group, he was a tailor. He just plucked some threads and he inserted those shirt pieces in the cuffs and collars of a shirt. And we agreed that the first one who will be called out will wear this shirt and go out. Maybe a month passed by and my name was called. I jumped to the shirt and wore it. One of them said to me, "Please don't forget us." They had this hope that when I go out, I could help them. There are millions of Syrians that now need justice. The value of these shirt pieces, I hope that it plays a part in holding some people accountable.
Distinguished members, Holocaust survivors, Syrian survivors, friends and colleagues, it's a privilege to be with you to mark this somber day. Our institution was created to serve as a living memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, to teach the history and lessons of the Holocaust, including that it was preventable, and to remind individuals that each of us has a role to play in building a future world free of genocide and related crimes against humanity. As our founding chairman, Elie Wiesel, wrote, "A memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past." That's why the museum aspires to be the voice for victims today that the Jews in the 1930s and 40s did not have. And that's what we are seeking to do today alongside the leadership of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee. It's been a profound honor to work with them and to work over the past many years with our heroic Syrian partners to share their stories with the world through exhibits, videos, events, online, and in reports that document the horrors committed by the Assad regime. This act of pausing today to commemorate is not simply an act of remembrance. It is a means of advancing justice by acknowledging what happened and countering denial. It is an act of remembering the victims as individuals, not just statistics, and of reminding the world that lives are still at risk. Today, we gather to mark 10 years of needless suffering and death as a result of the crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Assad regime. In the past 10 years, we have done this in the hallowed halls of Congress. Today, we do it virtually, and in doing so, are engaging in a global conversation about how collectively we can help protect Syrians. But also we do it to reflect on where we have failed. The study of Holocaust history helps us look back and ask questions of ourselves to see where warning signs were missed and where wishful thinking prevailed. For the Syrian people, those questions are more than relevant. They are a matter of life and death. And now to provide a historical perspective on why the museum cares so deeply about the Syrian people, it's my honor to introduce Holocaust survivor and volunteer at the museum, Dora Kleiman. Dora's powerful story is a reminder of the importance of working harder in our commitment to never again.
My name is Dora Kleiman. As a Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer, I'm honored to be here with you today, marking the 10th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. I was born in January 1938 in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, a country cobbled together after World War I. It was a country of differing historical alliances, several languages, and various religions. Following the German invasion of Yugoslavia in April of 1941, and with the support of Germany, the ultra-nationalist group, the Ustaše, assumed leadership of the so-called independent state of Croatia. Hardly independent, it was a puppet government of Nazi Germany, eager to persecute anyone who was not aligned with them politically or was Croatian and Catholic. Specifically, that included communists, Roma, Serbs, and Jews. My maternal family members lived in Ludbreg, a small town in the north of Croatia. My grandfather, the town's rabbi, had served the Jewish community there for many years. Our family had a very cordial relationship with the predominantly Catholic population, and for the 40 years my family lived there, practically no anti-Semitic incidents occurred. My Aunt Giza and her longtime close friend, Ludva Vrancic, a local bank director, had all but decided not to marry. However, fear of the German invasion of Yugoslavia changed their minds. The hope was that Ludva's Catholic identity would protect Giza from persecution. By June 1941, Just a few months after the Nazis marched into Yugoslavia, my parents and infant brother, Zdravko, were arrested. My father was deported to the Jasenovac concentration camp, and my mother was sent to Stara Gradiška, a sub-camp of Jasenovac. Neither survived. Fortunately, my little brother was saved by our housekeeper and brought to Ludbreg, where I had been staying with my extended family. My brother and I were first sheltered by our grandparents, but by 1942, nearly the entire Jewish community of Ludbreg had been deported, including my grandparents and the majority of my family members. All were soon killed in Jasenovac. We were left behind with my Aunt Giza and her Catholic husband, Ludva. In 1943, Ludva was arrested on suspicion of supporting the partisan resistance movement and was sent to Jasenovac. In his absence, my Aunt Giza was denounced, arrested, and deported to Auschwitz, where she died of illness shortly after arrival. During this time, my brother and I hid with our Catholic neighbors, the Runjaks, and pretended to be their children. Most people in Ludbreg knew we were Jewish, but they never denounced us. Sometime later, Ludva was released along with other political prisoners. Fearing the worst and having been warned that the local priest made threats toward us while we were with the Runjak family, my brother and I were baptized for added protection. After liberation, we waited in vain for our family members to return. Knowing that our parents would not return, Uncle Ludva adopted my brother and me, and we sought to rebuild our lives in what became Yugoslavia. The Nazis and the Ustaše killed hundreds of thousands of people they identified as the other, people they decided did not have the right to exist. The history of the Holocaust, my history, highlights the precariousness of the persecuted peoples and the power of individuals, even whole towns, to stand up and do what is right, even in extraordinary times. It also reminds us that people can rise and fight political oppression, but that it takes more than just an internal uprising to achieve victory over a powerful and ruthless government. Tragically, we all know that hatred, even genocide, did not end with the Holocaust. What became my country after World War II, Yugoslavia, experienced yet another genocide in more recent times. We continue to witness in many parts of the world persecution based on religious or ethnic identity or perceived political support. In Syria, hundreds of thousands have been killed and millions have been driven from their homes by war and brutal attacks on the civilian population. But the refugees and those displaced within Syria have found the world deaf to their pleas, professing helplessness or feigning ignorance. Those of us who lived through similar circumstances during the Holocaust and who hoped at its end that the world may have learned something that never again might come true, must not remain silent. We must all lift our voices in pleas and in protest, in calls for action to create a better world.
It is my deep honor to introduce the United States Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, Joey Hood. The Department of State kindly prepared this video for inclusion in our March 11th policy discussion that the museum convened with the Syrian Emergency Task Force and the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation, and again for today.
This March marks the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. We join today with our hosts at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to remember all of those who have suffered the brutality of the Assad regime. We honor the many brave Syrians who took to the streets a decade ago and who continue to speak out today to advance human rights, fighting for the freedom and dignity of all Syrians now and for that of future generations. The United States stands with the people of Syria and remains deeply committed to pursuing justice for the victims of the Assad regime's atrocities. We will continue to work with the United Nations, like-minded countries, and Syrian civil society partners like the Syrian Emergency Task Force, which organized this event to pursue accountability and demand the release of the thousands of Syrians who have been arbitrarily detained. Now more than ever, justice and respect for human rights need to be at the forefront of our collective efforts toward a political solution in Syria.
We are deeply honored to have Amina Kulani, the co-founder of the Families for Freedom and the director of the Syrian British Council, join us. Amina is a former detainee and survivor of torture. She is a tireless advocate for the Syrian people, and in 2020 was awarded the International Woman of Courage Award by the US Department of State. Amina, thank you for sharing with us your experience and for joining us today. I wanted to start just by asking you if you could share with us a little bit about what happened to you and to your brothers.
عندما انطلقت الثورة السورية بال2011 بآذار الحراك الشعبي في سوريا المطالب بالحرية والكرامة، كنت مع مجموعة من النساء والشباب في داريا، ومنهم إخوتي شاركنا بالحراك السلمي بالمظاهرات. الحركة أدت لاعتقال إخوتي في البداية الاثنين، مجد وكان من قادة الحراك السلمي، وبعدين أخي عبد، وبعدين تم اعتقالي مع زوجي وأولادي. ثم اعتقلوا إخواتي اثنين، محمد وبلال، رغم أنه أخي محمد وبلال كانوا ما لهم مشاركة، لكن اعتقلوا على خلفية اسم العائلة وعلى خلفية اسم المدينة اللي شاركت بالثورة. الحقيقة التجربة طويلة يعني، والقصة مؤلمة جدا للحديث عنها طول. لا أعرف صدقا من أين أبدأ، لكن تجربة الاعتقال لي ولتقريبا نصف عائلتي، أنا وزوجي وأخواتي الأربعة كنا في المعتقل، كانت مؤلمة جدا. لن أدخل بتفاصيلها، لكن بعد بالنسبة لعائلتي كانت مريرة جدا، لأنه بعد ما أنا طلعت من المعتقل بقيت 6 أشهر، تعرضت للتعذيب النفسي والجسدي، وشاهدت هذا الشيء على غيري من المعتقلات. بقي زوجي 2.5 سنين، لكن للأسف إخوتي الأربعة واحد منهم طلع اللي هو بلال، وطلع بعد أشهر طويلة، لكن للأسف إخواتي أخي مات. صورته مع صور سيزر قيصر في بداية تسريب الملف، استشهد تحت التعذيب. وإخوتي مجد وعبد وهم من الحراك السلمي ومعروفين بذلك. وصلنا بمنتصف 2018 النظام بتصدير شهادات وفاة لآلاف المعتقلين عنده، وكان نصيب مدينة داريا بنفس الدفعة 1000 شهادة وفاة ل1000 معتقل. كان أخوتي منهم عبد ومجد وصلنا خبر وشهادة وفاة، ووصلنا خبر أنه تم إعدامهم في سجن صيدنايا العسكري. صعب، الخبر كان مفجع جدا، أكثر من فاجعة يعني بالنسبة لنا. حقيقة اليوم يمكن أعيش أنا أعيش بأمان اليوم، يمكن بأمان فيزيائي كوني أعيش في أوروبا، لكن أنا وعائلتي نعيش بنصف روح. حقيقة هذا ليس وصف، لأنه نصف عائلتي غير موجودين. يعني هاي صور إخواتي، هم شباب بعمر الورد. مجد كان طالب في السنة الثانية، هذا مجد وكان يحب كرة القدم. محمد كان متزوج، عريس، لسه طفله ما طفله، فاستشهد قبل أن يرى ابنه حتى. عبد كان تاجر مليء بالحيوية والنشاط، وحرهم كلهم.
Amina, thank you so much for that, especially the part where you spoke about your brothers. Incredibly powerful. Your release have been working to try to help detainees and their families. Can you tell us about the work that you've been doing since you were released from detention?
أنا بقيت في المعتقل 6 أشهر، عانيت كتير. اليوم طلعت كان اختلط الفرح بالحزن، بين إني فرحانة بحريتي لكن متألمة حأترك وراي نساء وأطفال بالسجن. لذلك عاهدتهم كلهم إني أكون صوتهم في كل مكان. في لبنان رجعت مارست نشاطي الحقوقي كناشطة حقوق النساء، وهناك ضمن عدد من الأنشطة بدأنا أنا ومجموعة من السيدات سوريات، وكنا 5 سيدات أسسنا يعني لتكون منبر لدعم قضايا المعتقلين. أسسنا حركة سميناها حركة عائلات من أجل الحرية، ولحتى من خلالها تكون هي المنصة اللي نصادر من أجل إحنا ليس فقط كناشطات وإنما كعائلات المعتقلين من أجل المطالبة بحقوق المعتقلين والإفراج عنهم، ولتصبح قضية الاعتقال في سوريا قضية رأي عام عالمي. كانت تحدثت فيها بمجلس الأمن، أدليت بشهادتي، تحدثت بأصوات كل المعتقلين، بكل الأمهات، كل الإخوات. طلبت المجتمع الدولي أن يأخذ دوره يقوم بما عليه تجاه قضية المعتقلين في سوريا.
What do you want the American public and government officials to know and do, and what message do you have for them today, 10 years after you took to the streets?
ما رسالتي، يعني ما أريد أن أقوله للحكومة الأمريكية وللرئيس الأمريكي الجديد هي نفس الرسالة التي قلتها عندما كنت في واشنطن آذار الماضي. في هذه الأيام في نفس التوقيت كنت في واشنطن في الكونغرس في البيت الأبيض في الخارجية الأمريكية. كنت دائما أقول لهم نفس الرسالة. أنا أخذت عهد على نفسي أن أكون صوت هؤلاء المعتقلين. ساعدوني أن أفي بذلك الوعد. أنتم دولة عظمى، يمكن أن تفعلوا الكثير، لا يكفي التصريحات. يجب أن يكون هناك يعني حلولية لقضية المعتقلين. يجب أن تأخذ الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية دورها بشكل أكبر وفاعل أكثر في إطلاق سراح المعتقلين، وخاصة أنها تستطيع. لذلك الرسالة التي أوجهها للرئيس الأمريكي الجديد والحكومة الأمريكية: لماذا لا تجعلون في إرثكم للأجيال القادمة أنكم كنتم أول الداعمين للأمهات، للعائلات، الأخوات الذين مثل الزوجات بأن حصلوا على حريات أبنائهم، أو حتى من فقدوا أبنائهم، من قتل أبنائهم في المعتقلات حصلوا على قبور لهم. تخيلوا أن في سوريا الأمهات والزوجات يتمنون أحيانا أن نحصل على قبر، فقط نزور هذا القبر أو نحصل على الرفاه.
I know that it's so painful for you to have to come and say over and over and over again. And I mean, I'm sure it must be so difficult to go to the UN Security Council and tell them exactly this and then not see any action over and over. So I just want to, celebrate your courage, your strength. And I hope that we can share your message with people around the world on March 15th and afterwards, because our institution is committed to trying to put a spotlight and make sure that families like yours aren't forgotten. It is my honor to introduce the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Robert Menendez, and the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator James Risch.
Hello, I'm Senator Bob Menendez, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As we solemnly recognize the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising, we must continue to grapple with the brutal armed conflict and the unfathomable suffering of the Syrian people that has endured. Let me first thank the dedicated staff of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for convening this important event. For more than 10 years, the murderous Assad regime has waged a ruthless campaign of destruction against the Syrian people. Over the past 10 years, the regime's efforts have directly contributed to the deaths of an estimated 500,000 people and the displacement of over 11 million Syrians, nearly half of the country's pre-war population. The Assad regime has regularly violated the laws of armed conflict, employing chemical weapons against its own citizens, starvation as a siege tactic, barrel bombing hospitals, and imprisoning and torturing those who wish for a brighter national future. The regime uses humanitarian aid as a weapon of war, malviolently preventing humanitarian organizations and the United Nations from providing relief to any communities that oppose its rule. The chaos and destruction the Assad regime unleashed enabled the Islamic State and other armed groups to commit further violence against the Syrian people. The international community can and must do more. Whenever we confront violence and injustice, we are reminded over and over again that responsibility lies not just with the perpetrators, but also with those who have borne witness to these atrocities and stood silent. Or in the case of Russia and Iran, those who have not only willfully aided and abetted the perpetrators, but also actively participated in the slaughter to advance their own interests. And so while they are not sufficient to stop the suffering of the Syrian people, we will continue our efforts. We must relentlessly pursue accountability for these crimes against the Syrian people. I will be engaging with the administration in the coming months to push for greater humanitarian access in Syria, as well as greater oversight over the way in which the United Nations administers humanitarian aid in regime-controlled areas. And finally, we must keep raising awareness about what is going on in Syria, to show the Syrian people and their oppressors that the United States sees their suffering, is pushing for a better future, and to guard against similar atrocities in the future. The Holocaust Memorial Museum is a critical partner in this work. Thank you again for your contributions to this very noble effort.
Hello, I'm Senator Jim Risch, the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's my honor to join you all today as we solemnly observe the 10th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. Over the last decade, Bashar al-Assad has inflicted enormous suffering on the Syrian people and proven that he will do anything to preserve his grip on power. With military assistance and political cover from Russia and Iran, Assad has prolonged a campaign of torture, starvation, chemical weapons use, and barrel bombings against civilians. We must not let these atrocities go unpunished. The world was awakened to the ongoing horrors of the Syrian regime from the brave Caesar, a former military photographer who risked his life to expose the truth. Due to the unparalleled bravery of Caesar and other former Syrian detainees, the world is now aware of Assad's campaign of terror. As we look forward, we must not only stop this ongoing violence, but we must also promote accountability for these crimes. As part of this effort, Congress passed the Caesar Act, named of course after Caesar, to hold Assad and his backers responsible. Over the last year, the United States has sanctioned Assad, his family, his security forces, and organizations that fuel the regime's ongoing war. This important work must continue, and we remain committed to seeking accountability for the regime's atrocities. To further support the Syrian people, the United States has provided more than $13 billion in assistance since the start of the conflict. The United States will also continue to push for a political solution through UN Security Council Resolution 2254. To Assad and his backers, we say never again. We will continue to hold accountable those responsible for the plight of the Syrian people, and they should know the United States is always watching. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. God bless you all.
My honor to introduce Dr. Abdul Karim Exayez. In 2012, Dr. Exayez was training to be a neurosurgeon when his residency was interrupted. He joined Save the Children in Northwest Syria, where he led the health response until 2016.
Sure. Thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you for the Holocaust Memorial Museums for all your efforts with relation to the Syrian issue. So for me personally, when the revolution started in 2011, I was in the middle of my training program in Aleppo University. And then I joined some of the kind of peaceful demonstrations in the beginning because, being a Syrian citizen, I was, part of these ambitions to have more freedom, participation, and other kinds of simple rights. But at the same time, I was, focusing on my medical profession, to be provided to all people regardless of their political affiliations. But basically, when the demonstrations arrived to Aleppo city, where I was doing my training in 2012, we were pushed as medical staff to not treat protesters properly. And sometimes, we were not allowed to admit some people to the hospital or to do the right care, like operations, or to undergo, different interventions. And we were told many times that those people do not deserve this care, and we will just, take them to either the prison or, do just the basics so they can, speak to the investigators, and then we will do the rest. And that's why, we were pushed by, our kind of moral obligation to do more, to reach out to the people who were not able to reach to us in the hospitals. And that's why in 2012, especially after the Free Syrian Army entered Aleppo in July 2012, where the city basically was kind of split between the government, the regime, and the opposition, we had to go, to homes sometimes to operate, even, I would say minor surgeries and also sometimes big surgeries at homes. And we established what is called field secret hospitals in some places in parts of Aleppo. The first field hospital I established was in a basement of a mosque, where I've done sometimes even big surgeries in this very, under-resourced environment.
I can't even imagine what the conditions must have been like that you were working under. With the now 10 years of crimes that have been committed in conflict, what is the current situation like in terms of medical staff and the healthcare system in Syria, especially in those areas that are still under attack?
So these areas, has witnessed the brunt of atrocities in the Syrian conflict. From the very beginning, where we established these field hospitals, we were under enormous risk. Two of my colleagues in one neighborhood in Aleppo city called Saif al-Dawla, two of my colleagues were burned inside the hospital when they were kind of caught by the security agencies, by the Syrian regime. A lot of, horrible things happened when, these field hospitals or secret hospitals were caught by the Syrian army or the intelligence services. And when we moved to northwest of Syria, the healthcare system there, witnessed a lot of attacks on health facilities, on health personnel. First, a lot of health personnel were detained and killed under tortures. I have a lot of friends who were really, killed under torture in the Syrian prisons. There is no kind of conflict that I've read in the literature or that witnessed this large scale of attacks on healthcare and health personnels. So now the health system is even more stretched without proper resources, because the humanitarian response usually the resources were kind of being dried out.
I'm always struck by how remarkable and innovative the Syrian medical community has been and civil society community has been in trying to find ways to continue to provide care under the most dire of circumstances. The idea that people will continue to keep working underground, in caves, knowing that they are being specifically tracked and targeted simply because they provide life-saving assistance is truly astounding and humbling to think about. Dr. Exayez, if you were to say anything at this 10th anniversary to the American public and policymakers, what would be your message to them at this 10th anniversary?
So I would like to say that, Syrian people, they went through, huge sufferings in over the last 10 years. And these sufferings were visible to all people. And that's the difference between, previous genocides that maybe you heard of, but you didn't see. While now you see everything on a daily basis. Some people, they risk their lives to document these issues. The notable films for Sama and the Cave that were nominated for the Oscar, those people were really risking their lives to document and visualize this suffering, to show it to you. And the Caesar photos that people were trying to leak photos and documents to prove that, look, these sufferings, we're not making up stories. These stories are real, and we're risking our lives to prove that this is kind of the real situation we are suffering in Syria. So we still have hope that the American people and the USA would, help the Syrian people even more. So it is time now to put, the Syrian regime accountable, to hold them accountable, and also to say to the world that there is still a justice. Because, the caveat is that if perpetrators in Syria, they enjoyed impunity, I think this will risk the whole, system in the world, that, other perpetrators, elsewhere will say that we can do whatever we can without the fear of being held responsible and accountable. So I think there is a kind of moral responsibility of the international community, of the US, to act more. Because now I think after 10 years of the conflict, I think the situation is very clear.
Thank you so much, Karim. That was incredibly powerful. And I'm just sorry that you have to, I'm sure, every day convey these messages in the hopes that something is actually done. It is my honor to introduce the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks, and the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Michael McCall.
Hello, I'm Congressman Gregory Meeks, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. In the decades since the Syrian civil war, the people of Syria have been devastated by brutal conflict. Assad's regime has killed over 500,000 Syrians, including more than 60,000 children, and displaced over 12 million people. This crisis has not been limited to Syria's borders. Over the last decade, the shockwaves from this conflict have undermined regional stability and created the largest refugee and displacement crises of our time. Meanwhile, COVID has exacerbated conditions for those refugees who remain stranded in open fields without proper shelter or regular access to the most basic humanitarian relief and supplies. My colleagues in Congress and I strive to help restore peace and stability to Syria and its people. But we must do more. We must continue to push for full implementation of sanctions under the Caesar Act, not just on Assad and his Syrian supporters, but on those individuals and organizations outside of Syria who support his brutal dictatorship. However, this bill also gives the regime an off-ramp. If Assad chooses to refrain from bombarding his own people, frees political prisoners, and allows refugees to return home safely and with dignity, then these sanctions can be suspended. We must work with other nations in addressing this crisis. Sanctions should not be unilateral. Even targeted sanctions are better if we are working with others to make them matter. Simultaneously, Congress must continue to support efforts that provide humanitarian assistance to displaced Syrian civilians within and beyond that country's borders. I'm encouraged by the Biden administration's announcement that it intends to resume funding for Syria's stabilization programs previously suspended by the prior president, that it will increase humanitarian assistance and ensure such efforts are coordinated and effective. I thank the Simon Schultz Center for the Prevention of Genocide for hosting this very important commemorative event and for continuing to bring attention to the struggle of the Syrian people. I promise to continue working to aid the Syrian people until this terrible war finally comes to an end.
Hello, I'm Congressman Michael McCall, the lead Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to thank the Holocaust Museum for hosting this event and for their work to hold the Assad regime accountable for its ongoing crimes against humanity. Their efforts to help ensure that the world knows about the plight of the Syrian people. This event marks the 10th anniversary of the beginning of Assad's war against the Syrian people. Caesar's photographs are clear evidence of the atrocities Assad and his cronies have been committing for years. These images and the chilling testimony of survivors from Syria keep these offenses from being swept under the rug. That's why one of my top priorities has been urging other countries not to normalize relations with Assad. There can be no justice if relations with Syria return to business as usual. I hope and expect that the Biden administration will continue robust enforcement of the Caesar Act to hold Assad, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah accountable for this brutal war. We also need to continue to work together to stop Assad and Russia from blocking humanitarian assistance into Syria. In Congress, Syria has been an issue of bipartisan consensus. We are united not as Republicans or as Democrats, but rather as Americans and human beings working to protect innocent Syrian civilians. So I want to thank everyone for participating in the event today who have dedicated themselves to telling the stories of Syrians. Today, we remember the victims of the Assad regime, and my colleagues and I are committed to fighting for freedom for the Syrian people. And we will work to continue working with all of you to achieve that goal. Simply put, we will not give up.
Hi everyone, I'm Congressman Adam Kinzinger, and I'm the co-chair of the Friends of a Free, Stable, and Democratic Syria Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm honored to be joining you today, even though it's virtual, and I want to thank you all for taking part in this very important event as we enter a new decade of the human tragedy in Syria. We gather to remember the nearly 12 million refugees and internally displaced people, as well as the over 400,000 men, women, and children already killed by Bashar al-Assad. Over the past 10 years, the Syrian people have suffered immensely. While the international community has taken some steps to end Assad's reign, more needs to be done to hold this war criminal and his backers accountable for their crimes against humanity. We simply cannot ignore the horrific war crimes this tyrant has unleashed on the Syrian people. His brutal reign of relentless torture, chemical weapon attacks on children, barrel bombs on hospitals and schools cannot go unchecked. As the global leader for good, the United States must ensure that all his crimes are accounted for and that like-minded nations refuse to work with his regime. Only when Assad is no longer in power will we see a free, stable, and democratic Syria. As we all know, Caesar's bravery to document, smuggle, and share with the world the true nature of Assad's brutality opened all of our eyes. While it's said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, Caesar's photos are worth one: genocide. Evil flourishes in this world when good men and women refuse to do what's right. Just like Caesar, we must keep fighting for those who can no longer fight for themselves. Again, thank you all for being here. The U.S. Holocaust Museum for their tireless work to end genocide around the world. It is groups like these that bring to light the true horror of living under Assad's control. Now, as we listen to Caesar's words, let's not forget that Assad continues to detain and torture thousands of innocent men, women, and children. I fear that many of them could become another tally in Syria's death count if the world refuses to act.
To protect Caesar's security, he cannot join us in person. He has asked me to share this letter with you. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, and to the entire world, is it not enough for 10 years to pass of oppression and the killing, the detentions, the torture, and the displacement of a peaceful nation that is hardworking, patient, and loving of the entire world? And their only fault was that children in a small town wanted to express what they heard from the adults: freedom, dignity. These are the words that they heard from the grown-ups, and they loved these words, but they did not live them. They wrote them on the walls, and in return, the regime wrote, "Assad, or we burn the country," on their innocent bodies. And indeed, we all saw how this regime burned the rocks and the trees and the humans. I beg of you, do not leave these peaceful people under this criminal regime that lives on their blood and takes joy in their torture. You must know something. The Caesar law is not enough. Assad and his regime must leave forever. And long live Syria and the Syrian people, because they deserve freedom and dignity. And thank you all. Thank you, Caesar, Amina, Kareem, and all of our Syrian partners for your courage in speaking out. As we mark this day and redouble our commitment to working to protect the Syrian people, we at the museum are holding you, your loved ones, and the broader Syrian community close in our thoughts. Just this week, the plight of one of our partners, Mazen al-Hamada, was shared with the world. Mazen is in Syria, but his whereabouts and well-being are unknown. He tirelessly shared his experiences of torture with the world in the hopes it would help compel life-saving action and would, through the courts, bring his perpetrators to justice. Just a few weeks ago in Germany, a former Syrian intelligence officer was convicted of being an accessory to the commission of crimes against humanity. Mazen likely does not know how he and other survivors have sent a powerful signal to the Assad regime that the victims will not rest until justice is served and impunity will not prevail. Mazen's final recorded words should give us all pause and beg us to evaluate what we are doing and crucially can do as individuals, as a nation, as an international community to help Syrians who are facing crimes against humanity. He said, "We went to America and told them the whole story. We went to Germany and told them the whole story. We went to the Netherlands, France, and even Italy. And people didn't listen. The world didn't listen. Here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we know the consequence of inaction and the devastating cost that these types of crimes can have on communities and future generations. We therefore seek to do for communities today being victimized by genocide and related crimes against humanity what was not done for Jewish communities before and during the Holocaust. In closing, our hope is that this is the last year that we need to gather to mark the ongoing commission of crimes in Syria and assure the Syrian people that they have not been forgotten. Please share what you have heard here today, and thank you for joining us.